With 12 days left in the campaign, Kamala Harris has become the first presidential candidate in the history of this country who has to campaign against a candidate who praised Adolf Hitler in the White House. Here is a first look at a new Harris campaign ad about Donald Trump's admiration for Adolf Hitler and Hitler's generals.
Do you think he's a fascist?
He certainly falls into the general definition of a fascist. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader. The former president, certainly an authoritarian, using the military to go after American citizens is a very, very bad thing. He admires people who are dictators. He commented more than once that Hitler did some good things, too.
If he was left to his own devices, would he be a dictator if he didn't have people around him?
Oh, I think he'd love to be.
When somebody's the president, the authority is total.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
You'll hear what President Obama and Vice President Harris had to say about Donald Trump's admiration for Hitler at a big campaign event tonight in Georgia. In a moment, we'll bring that to you in a moment. But first, Donald Trump is finally worried about the Trump national sales tax. Here's the way Vice President Harris said it at that packed rally in Georgia tonight.
Donald Trump intends to impose a 20% Trump national sales tax on everyday basic necessities, which will cost the average family nearly $4,000 a year.
You know the opponent is worried in a political campaign when they use the language that the opposition is using against them to try to defend themselves. That's what Donald Trump did today in a desperate lie of a social media post saying, I am not proposing a national sales tax, as the Democrats say in their advertisements against me. Dems know what they are saying is a blatant lie. That, of course, is a lie. I am proposing tariffs on other countries that take advantage of us, hardly a national sales tax. These tariffs are paid for by the abusing country, not the American consumer. They do not cause inflation and will make America rich again, exclamation point. These tariffs are paid by the abusing country. That is the Trump lie. It's a lie that Donald Trump has gotten away with for almost 10 years now because none of the reporters at the New York Times or the Washington Post or any other news organization that has ever been allowed to interview Donald Trump has ever asked him, what is a tariff? Donald Trump would never be able to answer that question because the very simple truth of tariffs is that they are indeed a tax imposed on a person who buys a product from another country. Donald Trump wants to raise the price of every single television sold at Best Buy by as much as 60% because of tariffs that he would place on every one of those televisions. Every television sold at Best Buy is made in a foreign country, and Donald Trump wants to impose hundreds of dollars of tariffs on, say, a $1,000 TV. That makes the $1,000 TV cost $1,600. The price that you will see at Best Buy will not show the tariff. It'll just say $1,600. Best Buy will have already paid the tariff for you when those TVs were put on the Best Buy truck on the dock when they arrived in the shipping container. Best Buy is going to have to pay $600 at the dock right there to the United States Treasury in the form of a tariff. Best Buy is an American company. Best Buy gets its money from you. Best Buy is going to use that money from you at the dock to pay the tariff to the United States government. All of that tariff money, all of it, is American money paid inside the United States of America to the American government. And so, after Best Buy pays $600 at the dock to the federal government to bring that TV to the store, what do you think happens to the price tag of the TV at the store? It goes up by $600. That's called inflation. That's called pushing up prices by hundreds and hundreds of dollars, pushing up prices by pennies in some cases on very cheap products that cost less than $1, but pushing up prices on every single thing that is imported to this country. All 600 of those dollars from the tariff will go from Best Buy, an American company, to the United States Treasury as a sales tax. That's exactly what economists call a tariff. And that's why Donald Trump's tariffs will indeed cost you $4,000 a year as a family, at least. And that's why they are indeed a national sales tax. And that is why everyone in government prior to Donald Trump, everyone in politics prior to Donald Trump, has always regarded tariffs as a national sales tax, which is why they didn't think they could solve our problems with tariffs. A tax paid by Americans and only Americans, because the United States of America doesn't have power to tax anyone else. The United States of America doesn't have the power to tax China. It's impossible for the United States of America to impose a tax on China. So no, these tariffs are not paid by any other country. Donald Trump has lied to every one of his voters about that every day that he has ever mentioned tariffs, and there is not a single Trump voter anywhere in the country who has ever revealed himself or herself to be smart enough to know that Donald Trump is lying about tariffs. Not one of the Trump voters who work at Fox and talk to Donald Trump on TV is smart enough to know what a tariff actually is. No one working at Fox knows what a tariff is or who pays it, and those buffoons prove that every single time Donald mentions tariffs to them on Fox. But now Donald Trump is being prosecuted for his lies about tariffs by Kamala Harris. And she has found the right language for it. Trump national sales tax. That is exactly what it is. Donald Trump's radio minister of propaganda, Hugh Hewitt, got Donald Trump on the phone today. And I know for a fact that Hugh Hewitt knows what a tariff is and who pays a tariff and how it works, which is why Hugh Hewitt did not discuss tariffs with Donald Trump today. Donald Trump's minister of radio propaganda began his interview by saying this.
I've already voted for you and J.D. Vance.
That was before question one. And then Hugh Hewitt, who, unlike Donald Trump, knows how bad Hitler was, tried to help Donald Trump with Donald Trump's Hitler stuff.
Biographers are going to be writing about you for decades and centuries. And one of the questions they're going to come up against is, why do some people hate you so much? I mean, Trump derangement syndrome is a real thing. I've run into it. We saw it online repeatedly. The stuff they call you, the Hitler stuff, the fascist stuff.
The permanently and irrevocably disgraced Hugh Hewitt calls it the Hitler stuff, the fascist stuff. And yes, biographers and historians for centuries will easily find Donald Trump's White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, on audio tape quoting Donald Trump saying Hitler did some good things. No historian is going to struggle with why Americans who hate Hitler might also hate a person who admires Hitler. No historian is going to struggle with the question of why people might hate Donald Trump, knowing that Donald Trump praised Adolf Hitler and Adolf Hitler's generals who exterminated through industrialized daily mass murder over 6 million Jews, babies, great-grandfathers, grandmothers, parents, brothers, sisters, sometimes all together, exterminated them in their attempt to kill every Jewish person in Europe and eventually every Jew in the world. That was Hitler's ambition. And his generals supported him every day in that ambition. No historian has ever wondered why most people in the world hate Adolf Hitler to this day. Donald Trump could have said today, I hate Hitler, but he didn't. Because as Hugh Hewitt knows, Donald Trump appeals to a small sliver of American Nazi voters and those very sick people, some of whom are scattered in some of the battleground states where Donald Trump cannot afford to lose even one of them. And so it's been 2 days now, and Donald Trump has not condemned Hitler, but he has condemned the former Marine Corps General and White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who quotes Donald Trump expressing his admiration for Adolf Hitler and Adolf Hitler's generals. Here is Barack Obama's first comment about Donald Trump's Hitler worship. He said it tonight in Georgia.
Here's the interesting thing, is he acts so crazy and it's become so common that people no longer take it seriously. I'm here to explain to you, just because he acts goofy does not mean his presidency wouldn't be dangerous. And you do not have to take my word for it. Lately, some of the people who know Donald Trump best have been saying in no uncertain terms that he should not be president again. The other day, General John Kelly, Donald Trump's former chief of staff, said that Trump told him he wanted his generals to be like Hitler's generals. Now, don't boo, vote. Now, I want to explain that in politics, a good rule of thumb is don't say you want to do anything like Hitler. You know, that's just good political advice. But it is useful because it gives us a window into how Donald Trump thinks. And John Kelly isn't the only one saying this. Two of his defense secretaries, people who worked for him, said the same thing. His chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that is the top of the top brass in our military, said he is dangerous. Now, I happen to know John Kelly and Mark Miller. They served under me when I was commander-in-chief. These are serious people. This is a decorated soldier and Marine who served in battle. They are not, quote unquote, woke liberals. They are people who have never in the past even talked about politics because they believe that the military should be above politics. But the reason they're speaking up is because they have seen that in Donald Trump's mind, the military does not exist to serve the Constitution or the American people. He doesn't see being commander-in-chief as a solemn, sacred responsibility, just like everything else. He thinks the military exists to do his bidding, to serve his interests.
The Harris for President campaign had one of their biggest and most star-studded rallies tonight in Atlanta with Spike Lee and Samuel L. Jackson taking the stage along with Bruce Springsteen, both of Georgia's senators, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, and President Obama.
Kamala Harris is ready for the job. This is a leader who has spent her life fighting on behalf of people who need a voice, who need a champion. Kamala wasn't born into privilege. She was raised in a middle-class family. She worked at McDonald's when she was in college to pay her expenses. She didn't pretend to work at McDonald's when it was closed for a photo op. She actually cares what people are going through because she's seen it in her own family, in her own life. As a prosecutor, Kamala stood up for children who'd been victims of sexual abuse. As Attorney General of California, fought the big banks and for-profit colleges, secured billions of dollars for people after they'd been scammed. After the home mortgage crisis, Kamala pushed me and my administration hard to make sure homeowners got a fair settlement. It didn't matter that I was a Democrat, that she had knocked on doors for my campaign in Iowa. She was not going to let anybody stop her from winning as much relief as possible for families who deserved it. So the point I'm making, if you elect Kamala Harris, she will not be focused on her problems, her ego, her money. She's going to be focused on you. She's going to be focused on you.
President Obama gave the Georgia crowd their marching orders.
Now, you've heard this already. I am going to repeat it. We are going to keep repeating it. Here in Georgia, early voting has already started. So if you have not already, go vote. Return your absentee ballot. If you're going to vote, remember to bring your photo ID. If you need to figure out where to go to iwillvote.com/GA, and then you get your friends and you get your family to make a plan to vote. Because together we have a chance to choose a new generation of leadership in this country and start building a better and stronger and fairer and more hopeful America.
President Obama finished his speech with a rousing introduction of Vice President Kamala Harris.
Real strength is about working hard and taking responsibility and telling the truth even when it's inconvenient. Real strength is about helping people who need it and standing up for those who can't always stand up for themselves. That's what we should want in our daughters and our sons, and that's what I want to see in the President of the United States of America. And the good news is, we've got a candidate to vote for in this election who demonstrates that kind of character, who knows what real strength looks like, who will set a good example and do the right thing and leave this country better than she found it. That is what this election is about. And that is why it is my honor to introduce my friend, the next President of the United States of America, Vice President Kamala Harris.
Barack Obama. Oh, it's good to be back in Atlanta.
Kamala Harris has made history in many ways, and now she is the first candidate for president of the United States in history who is campaigning against a candidate who actually praised Adolf Hitler in the White House.
So much is on the line in this election, and this is not 2016 or 2020. The stakes are even higher because over the last years, and in particular the last 8 years, Donald Trump has become more confused, more unstable, and more angry. You see it every day. He has become increasingly unhinged. But last time, at least there were people around him who could control him. But do notice in this election, they're not with him this time. In fact, just this week, America heard from John Kelly, a retired four-star Marine general who was Trump's White House chief of staff, who said that as president, Trump praised Hitler. Take a moment to think about what that means. That Trump said, quote, Hitler did some good things. And that Trump wished he had generals like Hitler's, who would be loyal to Trump and not to America's Constitution. This is not 2016 and it is not 2020. Including because just a few months ago, the United States Supreme Court told the former president that he is effectively immune no matter what he does in the White House. Now just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrails. He, who will claim unchecked and extreme power if he is reelected, who has vowed that he will be a dictator on day one, who calls Americans who disagree with him, I'm going to quote, the enemy from within. You know what that harkens back to? He's calling Americans the enemy within, who says that he would use the military to go after them. And he who has called for the, quote, termination of the Constitution of the United States. Let us be very clear. Someone who suggests we should terminate the Constitution of the United States of America should never again stand behind the seal of the President of the United States of America. Never again. Never again.